Hey, how are you?
Good, good. How you doing?
I'm doing well, man.
That's good.
It's a
That's
little
good.
late, but hey, he's keeping up, right?
Yeah, he's awesome. How old is he?
3 days, 4 days.
Whoa,
Yeah, Brad's speaking new. He's a little guy.
that's
And
crazy.
how do you pronounce your
Hold
name?
on one second.
Sure.
Reminds me to shut the door as well.
And I'm sorry. How did you pronounce your name?
Angelos Kyriakides.
Angelos. Okay, awesome.
Yeah,
I'm Joel, obviously. So,
yeah,
first off, thanks for taking this debate, especially on short notice.
yeah.
We're giving the founders here a little bit of fun
Entertainment.
and enjoyment.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna jump right in here. So I'm going to first define a couple of terms: evolution and justified belief. I'm gonna lay out my contentions, and then I'm going to do a little thought experiment, and I'll pass the mic over to you. So first
Good.
off, that's good. All right. So first off, just getting into evolution and what I meant by evolution. I
Yeah.
suppose I could have gone a bit more specific um, with Darwinian evolution. So what you might call macroevolution.
Mhm.
And it is the simple belief that due to survival of the fittest or survival of the most able to adapt, organisms change over time, and less simple organisms can become more complex organisms. Um, I think that's a pretty uncontroversial definition. It's not exactly. I didn't source that. I kind of just went off my own head, but
That's fair. Yeah.
yeah. All right. Cool. So then, just getting into what justified belief means. So justified belief is an epistemological stance that takes into account warrant, probability, rationality, and justification. So to put it simply, a justified belief is a good belief or proper belief. It's not in incorrect and obviously incorrect belief. Now, I don't want to say that there's necessarily no problems with evolution or that there's certain things that aren't known as of yet or aren't understood as of yet. But when looking at it as a whole, it is more likely that it is true than it is not true. Does that work for you?
Um, I guess are we kind of equivocating uh justified with like warranted? Because that's more what I thought we were going for was like warranted belief.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
awesome.
I mean, it takes into account some other things besides warrant, but we could roll with that.
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe we'll change the topic later. Something.
Oh, evolution is a warranted belief. I don't know if we can change the topic after the fact, but
Yeah, probably not.
yeah, but we can roll with that. And I mean, it's pretty close to the same meaning. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, there's some other factors besides just warrant, but I think it's close enough for us to move forward. So I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
lay out my contentions, and I only have two contentions here. So the first is the fact that organisms change over time is an observable truth, and over enough time lends credence to evolution being a justified belief. My second contention is there is an overwhelming amount of scientific consensus for the belief in evolution, and deferring to the experts in their respective fields is the best way for laymen or unspecialized people to derive knowledge about very specific technical subjects. And then I'm just going to go into like a quick little kind of thought experiment story, and then I'll pass the mic to you. So, imagine a species. We'll call it a mammalian species, something like a monkey, right? And there's a population of monkeys over a geographic area, and there's some sort of geographic event that causes these two populations to occur. So one on, let's say, the right side of an island that splits away. Say the icebergs melt, a land bridge is no more. So there's a population of monkeys trapped on a large island, and there's a population of monkeys not trapped on a large island. And now, feel free to interrupt me if there's anything you actually disagree with, because I think I'll be going to a place that we're probably both generally in agreement. So on one species of an island, on the population that is on the island, there's a limited food source, and the best way to get food. Hold on one second. I'm gonna pass him off to my wife.
Yeah. Jesus loves you guys. Evolution is not justified, but I'll explain that later. This is just my caveat while he's gone, trying to sway the outcome of this debate while he's here, and he's back.
I'm sorry. Are you trying to get talking points in? Bad form. No, I'm just kidding. So we have a species on an island, and on this island, their only access to food source, their main access to food is insects buried deep within a tree. And these monkeys that have longer fingers have an advantage in getting those insects. Would you agree with me that over a certain period of time, the long-fingered monkeys would be more able to survive, and the long-fingered gene would be passed on, and the average length of finger on this particular island would increase?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's compatible with microevolution.
Yes.
Now imagine if this island was warmer. The mainland was colder, so the island's much warmer, and the testicles of the animal drop lower, or they tend to drop lower because the sperm needs to be cooler, kind of like it in humans, right? When it's warm, the testes drop lower, and when it's colder, they track closer to the body. So these animals on this warmer island, the testes drop lower, and the animals on the mainland where it's colder, they start to retract up more, closer to the body. And so far, you're in agreement with me?
Sure. Yeah.
Now, over a large enough period of time, the island, their testes could be so low that the female sex organ would start to adapt to that as well. And conversely, on the cold part, the female sex organ adapts to higher up testicles. And all of a sudden, just by means of not being able to necessarily fit the sex organ, like say a monkey from the mainland happened upon the island, he floated across on a coconut or something, they would be sexually incompatible just by means of not being able to fit their sex organs in. Would you consider that still?
Sure.
So now fast forward this 50,000 years or 100,000 years, all of a sudden we have what was once one species going into two species, and I think now this is where we'll disagree. But I wanted to hammer down exactly where we would disagree, because we agreed everything up to this point, but not at the point where we talk about a large period of time. So would you agree that if it was demonstrably true to you, say you hop into a time machine and see that the Earth was 3 billion years old, evolution would be, at least in your mind, a more warranted belief?
Not really. I mean, let's just say hypothetically that I did believe the Earth was 4 billion years old. That still wouldn't justify. I mean, obviously it helps the evolutionary process make it more feasible, but I mean, by any means, it's still not feasible as far as I can tell.
Well, I would say it's actually critical to the evolutionary process. I would say without a 3 billion-year-old Earth.
Yeah.
I wouldn't believe in evolution. If you could demonstrate to me, if I could hop in that time machine and you could show me that the Earth was 6,000 years old, well, then I would be sold on your view of it. I'd completely agree with you.
Yeah, I whenever one assumes the evolutionary hypothesis, they're automatically assuming the large scale of time as well.
Right.
I'm just saying, regardless of whether the large scale of time is true or not, I still don't think there's warrant for evolution.
Sure.
In any case.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Fair enough. We'll get into that a bit later, but I'm sure you have an opening statement, so I'll just pass it on over to you.
Yeah. Don't really have anything. This is kind of off the cuff. But thank you for doing this. I kind of wanted to debate with you, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to get onto kind of the scientific proof for God. But for evolution, I might have to quiet down because my kids are sleeping a little bit. But
I'm sorry, no worries. I know
I'm already soft-spoken, so it doesn't help. But so evolution, as you know, classically defined, is random mutation plus natural selection equals kind of like grand scale changes. But I agree with you in virtually everything you said. But and just like when Darwin he concocted the theory of evolution, I mean, he was basing his idea off of observations, which we all agree to. There's adaptation, there's variation. The finches on Galapagos Islands, for example, they all had different sized beaks. They all derived from one same finch. But because they were separated by land and, because certain birds were able to pass on their genes more effectively than those birds, micro-evolved different beaks, so to speak. But where we run into like fantasy land, to use kind of a different way of thinking about it, is like when you presuppose that fish somehow, first of all, I'd like to clarify that mutations are mistakes in the genomes. They're not things that actually produce kind of more complex structures. So when we suppose that when an animal makes a mistake in its genome, and somehow like maybe 0.01 times that genome may be relatively beneficial. Long story short, first of all, it's not observable. There's no evidence to kind of to put behind it. It's basically an idea that existed in the mind of Charles Darwin. He was influenced by Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell wrote a book on kind of like geological strata and all that stuff, which we can get into, which involves more of like the age of the Earth. But by any means, evolution is just not demonstrable. It's not observable, and the evolution scheme that somehow over time you can produce a more complex being through mutations, which are essentially mistakes, is the same as saying like there's an assembly line of making cars, and the assembly line makes a mistake, and somehow over time those mistakes will turn that car into an airplane of some sorts. Like, we're talking about functional beings that are clearly created the way that they were. It's impossible. Like, if you would like to explain to me how any of the macro changes took place, I would love to kind of pick your brain on that. When we talk about fish sort of mutating into amphibians, or amphibians mutating into reptiles mutating into birds, if you would like to explain any of that, I would love to kind of pick your brain on that, because that to me is just so far-fetched. It's not even funny. When you look at how you postulate evolution is supposed to work, and I love biology, I love reading the textbooks, but when you actually look at the pictures and you look at all the supposed evidences that are supposed to justify or warrant or back up or found evolution, they do not support. They're not evidences whatsoever. Like, you look at the fossil record, you look at vestigial organs, these things are not in any way, shape, or form. They don't speak. They don't give any concrete evidence as to the fact that fish somehow mutated into amphibians. If you would like to explain any of those macro changes, which is what the Darwinian evolution supposes, I'd be interested to hear that. But moreover, it basically comes down to the genome. Every creature is unique in that it has a certain set of instructions in its DNA. And our DNA, for example, is about the size of the Britannica Encyclopedia series. If you want to take even one word out of that encyclopedia series and mess it up so that that's a mutation or a mistake, that could kill off the human. So when we suppose that somehow these codes of information, by making mistakes, can produce more complex and more well-built structures, that defies logic in every sense. And furthermore, there's no evidence that any of that could ever happen. To go on, I mean, you look at science. Science is always in a state of flux. Darwin was pretty popular back then, but nowadays scientists are obviously catching on to the holes in evolution. And you look at, just Google scientific descent from Darwinism, and you can see scientists from every Ivy League university in the world, Stanford, Princeton, Harvard, everything. These people just don't buy it. And it's mostly being championed by guys like Stephen C. Meyer and Michael Behe, those who are not ashamed to kind of say, hey, this doesn't make sense. And like, it's just, yeah, those are kind of a few things. But if you want to discuss anything that I've said, that's feel free to. I'll just pass the mic back to you.
Sure. All right. So thank you. So what I picked up on there is evolution is untrue because it's not demonstratable, or at least that's some aspect of what makes it untrue, is the fact that it's not demonstratable. Did I get you about right on that?
Yeah.
Because it can't be demonstrated. Mm-hmm.
That's not the crux of it, but I mean that's
at least part of it. That's one aspect of it. Okay, sure. So 2 squared by -2, is that demonstratable?
Even if you take away the whole demonstratable aspect, I mean, even logically, it's
all right. All right. Yeah. So am I right? I don't want to put words in your mouth. Am I right that you see at that point that just demonstratable or not demonstratable, that has no bearing on the actual truth or untruth of the statement?
Sure, but if it was true, you would suspect that the results of it happening in the past would be evidence for us today. But then again, there's zero evidence that it has ever happened in the past. So that would be a form of demonstration that we don't see. And that speaks to its lack of authenticity. If you want to, obviously, not everything is demonstratable, but there should be observable evidence that we can see things. So you're going into something like abstract topics like math, and there's the world of abstract, but we're talking about physical sciences here, but more specifically historical science. And historical science is based off what has happened in the past, and we kind of use abductive reasoning to gather what took place. And judging by what we see today, there's still zero evidence to suppose that any evolutionary process has ever taken place.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll get into some evidence, but I kind of I'm trying to unpack what you said in your opening.
Yeah.
So, I think we're in agreement that the demonstratableness or the lack of ability to demonstrate is not necessarily indicative of something being true or untrue. It's just, can it be demonstrated or can it not be demonstrated?
What if I told you that evolution could be demonstrated? Just to give you but it hasn't been demonstrated. I could give you a brief example, but I don't want to cut off your time.
Sure. Okay. I appreciate that. Well, I agree that it can be demonstrated, and I think in the beginning you were sort of agreeing that it can be demonstrated, at least in our limited short lives. I mean, I think.
Can I ask you a question?
Oh, by all means.
Sure. So if we could observe an organism for, say, 10 million years, what are the chances of some sort of macro evolutionary change happening? Do you think that we would observe something happen?
Well, you're going to have to give me some context because there are some organisms.
Speaking,
say again.
just hypothetically speaking, if we could observe any organism for 10 million years, do you think we would observe macroevolutionary change?
And again, it's going to depend on the context because there are some organisms that have been around for a very, very long time. Sharks, some crustaceans that have been around, some reptiles that I would say have been around for 10 million years and haven't really shown macroevolutionary change. Now, there's some other organisms, mammalians, that I would think probably would show some change, and that change is reflected in the fossil record. Now, you say that there's no evidence, but you don't really give a reason why there's no evidence, because there's a whole lot of really well-educated, well-versed people that do believe that there's evidence.
Okay, how about you state your evidence, and I'll tell you what my thoughts are on the evidence, because I read the biology textbooks and I read the evidence, and yeah, why don't you share what you think is evidence?
Hold on, man. Let's not put our wagon before our horse here. So
yeah, sorry.
Now there's a couple of things I wanted to go back over. So you talked about mutations being mistakes. Mutations aren't mistakes. Mutations are changes. They could be a mistake, and probably more often than not, they are a mistake, and they do lead to an organism dying or not being able to pass on genes. But assuming that the Earth is 3 billion years old, some would be, just by the laws of probability, an advantage. Yeah, or nah?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that in certain viruses and bacteria where they mutate and they kind of lose something that actually benefits them in some way. But here's where the problem comes in, is that when you see one beneficial mutation, that doesn't change an organism's genome, and it can't, no matter how much time you give, you cannot use what are essentially depletions of genetic information to create higher, more evolved species. There's no way that let's just say that we had a set of instructions for building a playground in my backyard. There's no way that I could somehow, rip a corner off of the blueprints for those that playground, and somehow it would create more complexity. That's just illogical, and there's no evidence for that whatsoever. So let's just say that I take a corner of the blueprint, which was actually a bad design that didn't work, right, off of the blueprint, and somehow the playground was better. Do you think that playground, which, quote unquote, survives and continues to be ripped off, have, different pages, different parts of its design ripped off, will somehow become a better playground over time? I mean, that's just, when you understand the genome and how it functions and what mutations and natural selection presupposes, the idea of something becoming more complex and better over time is simply foolish. And I'm not saying you're foolish. I'm just saying the idea behind.
I understand. No worries. I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
But I mean, we've already laid out in our beginning, in our opening thought experiment, how greater complexity could happen, or when I say greater complexity, a greater ability to adapt to a given set of circumstances could happen, and we were in agreement.
Well, you didn't explain how, you said that one species wasn't able to procreate anymore. And
just because their sex organs no longer would fit into one another.
Right.
Orifices.
So how did that species kind of continue then? And become a separate species?
Okay, sure. So going back, so we have the monkey species. Let's call it on Africa, and then there's the island of Madagascar.
Yeah.
And this monkey species, one time Madagascar was connected to Africa, some sort of event happened where they were no longer connected. So there's a species of monkeys. By right now, they are the same species. A population on Madagascar, a population on Africa. And we went through about how, the monkeys on Madagascar could develop longer fingers, and the monkeys on Africa could develops stubbier fingers. We talked. You remember that? And then I went into about how it could be warmer, which could cause a change in the sex organs on the respective islands. Yeah.
So one of the long fingers or stubby fingers dies out, correct?
Neither one would have to die out. They could both go on living just in a different set of circumstances.
What is the change of the sex organs produced then?
Just physically, they'd be unable to procreate. Suppose they came back into contact with one another due to a physical, the way that the penis is constructed, or
forgive my use. Unable to procreate, how are they still existing?
Unable to procreate with each other. So the population on Madagascar can procreate with the population on Madagascar, but the population now, I that to me seems a little bit like complexity. No,
that's variation. That's diversity. That's not creating a new species.
Well, they can't reproduce. With each other. There's significant.
Their original genome would still be the same, right?
Say again.
They would still have the same genome.
They'd be expressing different parts of the genome, and actually, if you look at how genetic work, or at least how I understand that, there is a lot of DNA that might be left over from our previously evolved ancestors that is no longer expressed. That's kind of buried code, so to speak. You get what I'm saying? Because we have information that's not necessarily expressed, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of get where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I mean that's what we see. That's how Darwin came up with the idea. We have variation, right? We have adaptation,
right?
But to suppose
that over 3 billion years, that adaptation, that speciation, that specialization leads to different. I mean, that's what it is. That's what the consensus is. But
let's take your example and run with it then.
Sure.
Shall we?
Let's do it.
Okay. So like I said, DNA is a specific set of instructions where even deleting like 1.0000001% of it, and that's being generous, could kill you basically. So we have this basic set of instructions for your monkey, right? And obviously a genome is large. Certain parts of it are expressed while other parts can be latent, dominant, recessive, whatever. Other parts cannot even be activated as of yet, or they could be dormant. But let's just say we have this basic set of instructions, and let's compare them to, a blueprint again, to say like a building, because that's essentially what DNA is. It's an instruction manual for how the organism is supposed to reproduce. So if one monkey, gets separated into two very varied monkeys, and one monkey has longer fingers and one monkey has kind of stubby fingers or whatever, they're still expressing out of the same genome. It's the same set of blueprints that they're working with, right? So let's just say that the ones with the apparently shorter fingers or stubby fingers, that's more expressed, right? And the other one is more expressing the long fingers. We're still an impossibility away from extrapolating that into making a more complex genome. The genome is still the same, right? There's no way, evolutionarily speaking, or through the long process of time whatsoever, that we can produce more genetic information by either deleting or adding mutations to the genome. DNA, this is what I wanted to get into with our other debate. DNA is information. It is digital code that is needed to communicate the instructions for how an organism is supposed to reproduce. And that genetic code can only come from information. It can only come from intelligence. So in order to create a more complex being, you have to have a source of intelligence behind that, creating a different set of blueprints, a more kind of expansive set of instructions for the higher organism. There's no way that by mistakes we can somehow, or changes, let's go with changes, there's no way with random changes that you can somehow turn a monkey that has expressed certain parts of its genome into a completely different species, such as ourselves. People like to tout the idea that chimpanzees and humans are related to one another, but the difference between even chimps and humans is so genetically huge that there's no way that we could have somehow jumped from chimpanzee to human. It's the equivalent of writing, probably 500 pages of, and that's probably, I'm just being very very I can't think of the right word. That's being very frugal with my numbers. I just like to think of in terms of information pages, and how the human genome is so many pages, and therefore, but even jumping from a chimpanzee's genetic makeup to a human's genetic makeup is still impossible. So in terms of information and how, creating a different blueprint for that sort of animal, humans, but yeah.
Do you know, just in terms of mainstream science, the mainstream study of genetics, how much genetic information we actually share with chimpanzees? If you could slap a percentage on it, how much information do you think is exactly the same between a chimpanzee and a human? Would you willing to wager against?
I know what the thoughts are on that. People say anywhere from 97 to 99% similar to chimps.
Right. So that's not a huge difference. That's a very small difference.
Okay, but in terms of genetic code, but before we get into that, when we think about the test, right? When scientists are doing these tests, they're already presupposing Darwinian evolution. So that answer is already looked at within their mind. Furthermore, the region where those scientists who kind of compared human chimps to human DNA to chimp DNA, the region that they looked at on the genome was basically like almost 4% of the entire genome. They didn't look at the rest of the entire genome. They looked at the part of the genome that they knew was similar. So there was basically like, I'm going to be very frugal again with my numbers because I don't remember exact numbers, but there was, let's say, 50% of the genome that they didn't even explore, which was non-coding genome. But let's just go ahead with the 99% idea and say that there was 1% genetic difference between a human and a chimp. That's still, how many pages? Do you think that 100 or 500 pages of information can come out by deleting? Like, this is where evolutionists really are either ignorant, or they just ignorant as in they're ignoring this, or ignorant as in they're unaware of how the genome works. And to suppose that somehow we could create more genetic information, even my point in bringing up the chimp is that we're the most similar, according to evolutionary scientists, chimps and humans. But even jumping from a chimp to a human is impossible in terms of expanding the chimp genome to look like a human genome. It doesn't make sense once you understand how DNA works.
Right. So you're saying complexity can't be added. I would disagree with you on that.
It cannot be created by randomness.
Well, actually, that's exactly where I would say it's created, through this DNA being replicated over and over and over again.
That's fine. I don't have a problem with replication, natural selection, all of that. The problem is where you try to input genetic information into something. That doesn't work.
If I may.
Yeah.
So this replication occurs, and mutation occurs. Some mutation will be advantageous. Therefore, I suppose as you're defining it, adding complexity. Some mutation, and
it doesn't add complexity. What it does is
it's advantageous. If it's advantageous and it creates new ways for this organism to adapt to its world, that's not adding complexity?
No, complexity would be akin to like, writing a word, and complexity would be like akin to adding another word. When you take a word and you minus a letter, that somehow makes it more agreeable to your conversation, that's not adding complexity. All you're doing is changing something to somehow make it more beneficial in the state that it's already in.
Gosh. All right. So my point is, over many hundreds of thousands of years, variations occur, some advantageous, and causing an organism to be more able to adapt to its environment. But we've laid out our actual claims. I wanted to take this real fast. We only got 10 minutes left into my other contention, scientific consensus. So you mentioned about how scientists come at this already assuming that evolution's true, or Darwinian evolution's true. And I would say,
it's like fire, basically.
And I would say the young Earth creationist looks at every single problem and tries to fit it into the biblical narrative. There's not, to my mind, there are many atheists, agnostics, secularists, even Christian scientists that take this worldview, and there aren't many that come from a place of Darwinian. There are some, there are outliers. Look at the evidence, just as a matter of big numbers. There's not many that look at this evidence and think, you know what, the young Earth takes, that makes a lot of sense. Now, there are a whole lot of people that come at it already believing strongly in Christianity for whatever reason, and try to apply their Christianity to evolution, to the natural sciences. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about scientific consensus, and specifically Project Steve. You ever heard of Project Steve? Do you know roughly about how many people?
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
Like, I don't want you to get into this whole thing, and I'll just kind of admit right at the onset that scientific consensus, I don't really accept that as evidence, because consensus doesn't demonstrate kind of intelligible facts. That doesn't really mean a whole lot if a whole people agree on something.
Right.
But what I would encourage you to do is show me evidence for evolution. So if so far all we've discussed is a hypothesis, an idea that is a very far-fetched one in my estimation, but if you can provide any evidence that idea is somehow founded upon facts, I will talk about that.
No, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm not a natural scientist at all. I come from the world of philosophy, right? Now, I don't have the ability to go out and to really delve into really complex issues. You know, my knowledge is maybe slightly above a layman. But what I can do, and what I feel like is justified in doing, is look at what the experts are saying. And we do this in other aspects of our life. I mean,
but I can cite experts as well. So, I mean,
yes, you can cite experts, and you can cite experts as well. And that's why I wanted to get into Project Steve. So Project Steve, so there was about...
It's already well known that evolutionists are in the majority. So
that there's an overwhelming consensus in the scientific community amongst people that actually go through and dedicate their lives to studying this, right? So are all those people wrong? Are they all willfully ignorant? Now you talk about how they presuppose that Darwinian evolution is true. Most people are not atheists. No, most people aren't secularists. So just assuming that,
yes, they are though.
Right, in universities they are.
Yeah, which is where science is propagated. So.
Right. So assuming that the university is feeding from the general population, well, there must be something happening in the universities to make them change their mind. Assuming that the people going into the universities, I mean, do the people going to the universities just attract more atheists, or more? I don't even want to say atheists because it's not atheists. There's many Christian scientists that believe this. I mean, is it?
I mean, in response to this, I mean, I'd like to hear about Project Steve, although I'm not sure if it merits anything. But I mean, on another note, you can look at the documentary Expelled, where it talks about it was a good documentary made by Ben Stein, you know, the kind of comedian guy, who was a former speechwriter for Richard Nixon. But he made a documentary about how it's so taboo to speak about anti-evolutionism or the idea that there's an intelligent creator in university campuses that people are literally losing their jobs for even publishing articles about intelligent design or saying that, hey, we think this is kind of out to lunch. And these people, they interviewed a lot of university professors, and they had to actually hide their face because they're like, if we say we think this is crazy, we'll lose our job. So one has to take into account the actual culture and the climate
Okay.
of our universities today, where if you disagree with the majority, you are blacklisted and you're looked at as crazy, even though more and more ground is being given to those who obviously see the failings of evolution.
So the conspiracy amongst academia to suppress the truth, is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't say it's a conspiracy as much as it is a general culture that you're not allowed to disagree.
If they're firing people, right?
Yeah.
To hide the truth.
Yeah, which is documented. And they're not.
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt that a professor that takes a view that is unsupported by any of the literature that went before it, that takes a view completely out of left field, loses their job in the natural science department. And actually, I'm okay with that.
Okay, but see, you just made the assertion that it was unsupported. See, so far we've talked about the culture of academia. We've talked about hypothetical scenarios, but we haven't actually discussed evidence. So if evolution is true, let's hear some evidence.
Sure.
That I can back on, because so far all we have is Darwin's idea after witnessing some varied finches on the Galapagos Islands that somehow everything can be traced back to a single organism. And for that idea, not only is it preposterous to think about the macroevolutionary changes, say from like a fish to an amphibian or a reptile to a bird, that is lunacy to think that could actually happen. And if anybody can explain that to me, I would love to just talk with you about it.
So all these scientists, they all believe in lunacy.
Why don't you share with me your thoughts instead of appealing to what scientists believe, which is what everybody else does?
Yeah, sure.
Right. That's why we're all appealing to what other people think. Right. But I can show you what some of the scientists and the evolutionary experts think, and they admit there's no evidence for this. Right. But let's hear your thoughts. Right. Instead of appealing to scientists, let's hear
of course
what you thought about this. Yeah.
Well, I explained why I appealed to scientists. I if we wanted to talk about like morality or something, that'd be much more within my realm of. But hold on. May I finish?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So I talked about why I look to scientists to acquire information, just the same way that I defer to the American Association of Pediatrics. Right. Now, you asked for evidence, and I would point to the fossil record. So you want my evidence? I mean, there it is, man. It's what preserved fossils we have from the past. And
so
what
can I talk about the fossil record then?
Sure, you got 2 minutes, man.
Okay. So I'm glad you brought up one strain of evidence, right? And this is what first I'll read to you what Darwin said about the fossil record. Darwin said, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? We're talking about transitional fossils here. Why then is not every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Now, fast forward to 100 or so years later, after Darwin made this claim, the fossil record has expanded, like it's exploded since Darwin's time. Darwin's admitting at his time that we have no evidence of transitional fossils. Now that the fossil record has exploded, we have, let's say, 1,000 times more fossils than we did at Darwin's time. This is what famous paleontologist and champion of evolution Stephen Jay Gould says. The extreme rarity, and he's a Harvard paleontologist, by the way, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest, and this is what's important, the rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. So there we have one of the greatest.
Hey, I don't know if this is me or you, but I'm missing you anyway.
Sorry?
Transitional fossils. Let's see.
So can I just finish what I was
Australia,
saying?
Africanus, Pactetids, and Biculius.